Thank you, everybody, for joining GIMI Fintech. This is a weekly platform that basically we are gathered with innovators, experts around the world, basically, and researchers and professors of innovation. Our partners who are coming from 6 continents usually participate and attend this meeting every Wednesday. We usually talk either about the innovation state of a country or a trend, which is a cutting edge trend around innovation, or an innovation management tool and program that basically our partners, our GIMI alumni are using. Today, we are very glad of having a great friend of GIMI, and I excel in this basically GIMI Fintech. Tapfuma, he's basically a trade and investment executive with expertise in connecting African markets and other regions of the world. And basically, he will talk a lot about fintech ecosystem today and fintech and innovation and how he's changing basically African markets right now. I think Tapfuma, even though he's grown up in Canada, he has a passion and his heart is in Africa, and he's doing a lot in terms of developing the market. He has started from community development, and then he went to entrepreneurship, helped many companies got established, and basically worked in market intelligence, consulting multinational companies, seeking to penetrate African markets. Everything that he has done is, as I mentioned, around developing African markets and companies. Basically, his, I'll say, first commitment and job is a managing director at a private equity firm, which invests in growth companies across Africa. But also the second one commitment, and which I think is his baby, is AfriFursa, which is an organization which is basically gathering all diaspora and helping, you know, to bridge Africa and Canada, and working more around fintech ecosystem and how it can be shaped further in Africa. But I'll let Tapfuma explain more about it. Is of very high interest of what he's doing there, and he just had a summit around fintech, which was a success, I heard. So we would like to hear more from you, Tapfuma, and this topic, which is of high interest. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sharilla, for that wonderful introduction. Very accurate and very well put. It's such a pleasure to be here. It really is. I mean, one reason is that Hitendra, or I should call him Prof, was one of my professors at when I did my executive MBA, and really made an impact on me. You know, looking at innovation as a framework, as discipline, as a science, as opposed to just a moment of inspiration, is something that really stuck with me and I've carried with me since that time. So thank you very much, Prof and Darilla, for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now, and you can tell me when.
If I can just say one thing before you speak, just to share. It's always a pleasure to have our students grow up into great leaders. Tapfuma was a student of mine in the Rotman School. And one of the questions I posed to the students at that time, which is almost like about 7 years ago, 5 years ago, I said, do you guys think Africa is the next future? And Africa has the largest population of young people, emerging markets. You got countries like Nigeria, Kenya, which are really moving into the digital gap and closing the digital gap. And I asked a question. It was funny because 90% of the students basically went silent. And this is where Tapfuma says, I believe. And it is that kind of risk-taking and belief that allows you to know when the next big thing's going to happen. And just like China, nobody expected China to be what it is today. We are probably at the same place with Africa. And Tapfuma is going to share some great stories on this thing. So really a pleasure and an honor to see our students become leaders in their topics. So there you
go. Thanks so much, Prof. Thanks so much. And thanks for sharing that anecdote. It's one that, you know, that stuck with me. And yeah, it's really cool that it's It's full circle. Okay, so let me share. Okay, so tell me when you can see my screen, please.
Yes, we do.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, I think before we go any further, as is our custom here in Canada, many times what we do is acknowledge that I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples and their commitment to the stewardship of the land. We acknowledge the communities in Circle, the northwest, south, and eastern directions, and Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, Seneca, Chippewa, and the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit Peoples. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. So, and as we get into this, the title of the talk today is Fintech Innovation in Africa, Impact and Growth. And I will be sharing in the next 20 minutes about 54 different countries in Africa. So it's clearly an impossible task, but I'm going to do my best to provide you an overview of fintech, the fintech industry across the continent, which is booming at the moment. And it'll be a collection of my own observations, those of a co-author of mine, Kyle Hebert, I'd like to mention, and we've published a few pieces for The Banker, CIGI, which is a Canadian think tank, Africa.com, and a few others, as well as research. And I think what we'll do is we'll keep questions to the end. So, we'll go with what was originally proposed, and we'll have a 20-30 minute question and answer period after. There's just too much tech flying around for me to be able to manage questions and all that at the same time. So just a little bit about me personally. That's my wife and my kids. My wife is from South Africa. And on my three boys, keep me on my toes and keep me getting a little bit gray. They were all born in South Africa, but we now live in Canada. So, as Arilla was introducing me, I did live for 10 years in South Africa, lived and worked there, lived for a year in Ghana as well. And during my time there, my 11 years, did a lot of travel and work in facilitating investment and trade with the continent. And in terms of my professional life, as was mentioned, there's a private equity, Reagan Mills, and what's becoming more of my focus these days now is actually AfriFursa, the organization which I founded, and tends to focus on these three different spheres and the nexus of them. So FinTech, Africa, and Canada. And today we will be talking mainly about FinTech in Africa. So just briefly to give you an idea of what AfriFursa really is focused on, AfriFursa is really focused on shifting the narrative around Africa. And this is because, as that anecdote that Prof shared demonstrates, there's a lot of misinformation and underinformation around Africa. And I believe that's one of the core barriers to Canadians, at least, and many other global citizens engaging with Africa. So we highlight opportunities for equitable exchange between Africa and other regions and other stakeholders in the world. Fursa, for anyone here who might be Arabic speaking or Kiswahili speaking, Fursa means opportunities in those two languages. And our approach is we have three core pillars, which are the African diaspora, urban sustainability, youth, and it's all couched in an innovation framework. Excuse me. We also provide three core services, which is events, upskilling and consulting, and investment. This on the right there, you'll see a banner for our recent FinTech Summit, which Arilla did mention. It just happened a couple of weeks ago. It feels like it happened just yesterday. We brought together Canadian and African FinTech stakeholders for the second time. It was very well attended, had some incredible speakers, and you might hear me reference this event as we go today. So let's start by taking an overview quickly of the FinTech industry globally. So quick definition of FinTech. It's essentially new tech that seeks to improve and automate the delivery and use of financial services. If we look at that industry today globally, there's different numbers out there, and it's hard to actually pin down one, but we could say that in 2021, the global FinTech industry was worth $1.15 billion US. And is projected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 26%. And by 2030, the global industry will be valued at something close to $1 trillion US. So it's a quite big industry and it's growing very quickly. If we look at the different products or verticals within fintech, they're numerous. And these are here on the right, just a couple of examples, such as banking tech, insurtech, which is insurance offered through technology platforms, cryptocurrencies, which many of us are familiar with, payments, still one of the most popular forms of fintech, excuse me, investment tech, wealth management, neobanks, which are completely digital, and finance and accounting, and regtech, which is a vertical which is growing now and is really around regulation, know your customer, anti-money laundering, etc. Now let's take a look at Africa. So again, it's a region which is often referred to as one monolithic sort of region. So we tend to refer to it even as a country at times. And for the purposes of this discussion, I will be referencing Africa a lot, but let's actually take a look at it. It's comprised of 54 countries, 2,000 and more languages. And these are languages, not dialects. 1.3 billion people, close to 1.4 now. And it is a very nuanced region. So you can imagine with these numbers, you're not going to get any kind of monolithic, even with the different languages that carry different cultures. It's very nuanced. It's a very youthful continent, the most youthful continent. Average age is 19. In terms of the growth trajectories of the continent, it currently has the highest population growth in the world. And it's been this way for years. The population is actually expected to double by 2050, close to double. It has the fastest rate of urbanization in the world and ever observed in history. So there will be around 14 megacities, according to projections, in the next 30 years. Megacities have at least 10 million people. Currently, there are 3. Also has some of the world's fastest growing economies. So for years, 5 to 6 of the fastest growing economies have been based in Africa. This heat map here that I like to show is sourced from the IMF. And you can see based on the color of green, the darkness of the green, you can see which countries are growing the fastest. So overall, Africa is growing at around 3.9% in real GDP terms. But you've got anywhere from 6.7% right down to, I think, 1%, 1.5% in these 54 countries. Excuse me for a second. Let's take a look now at the global economic landscape. So as we ask ourselves, okay, what does fintech in Africa look like? Let's just zoom out a little bit. And here I've just noted some key points around both the global outlook and the African outlook currently. So global GDP is slowing down from 5.7 last year to 2.9 this year. Stagflation and inflation are hitting many economies. In some economies, 40-year highs. And as we know, in many advanced countries, central banks are implementing interest rate hikes, including here in Canada, to try and contain inflation. We're seeing it in food prices, we're seeing it at the fuel pump, and we're seeing as well, as a result, a global slowdown in investment and serious downward pressure on valuations. So an example in the fintech world that many of us might have come across is the company Klarna, which is Swedish founded, Swedish-based, and it's a buy now, pay later company. And their valuation was sitting at around 46 billion at their last raise, and now is sitting at 6.7 billion US dollars. So they lost 85% of their value in a very short time. And overall, there's a sense of fear and paranoia around recession. In Europe, it seems perhaps a lot more likely than here in North America, but there's still a lot of fear around this. In Africa, 20% today of Africans face chronic hunger. 30 million people were pushed into extreme poverty. 22 million people lost jobs due to the pandemic in 2021. The infrastructure gap, to look at some of the other underlying issues, requires financing of 68 to 108 billion US dollars annually in order to close the infrastructure gap across Africa. 65% of the continent is either unbanked or underbanked, meaning that they have access to financial services, but they are not meeting their needs. And then 22% of the continent currently has access to the internet. So when you look at these economic pictures, it's fair to say that the outlook is uncertain and that the risks are tilted to the downside. So as I'm here speaking to you today about fintech in Africa, the question really is, do opportunities really exist? And what I would put to you is that where many see threats and weaknesses, Africans see opportunities for growth and impact. And this is a very personal message for me, because having lived on the continent and worked right from community development to the corporate space, I have seen how some of the wicked problems that persist, some of the things I've mentioned already, such as hunger, the digital divide and so on, and poverty, are issues which face Africans all the time. But I've seen a resilience, I've seen a changing these threats and weaknesses and risks and challenges into opportunities that I had personally not seen anywhere. And this actually transformed my entrepreneurial drive. So when Prof was talking at the beginning about how it seems I was swimming upstream, and sometimes today it still does seem that way, I would credit a lot of that entrepreneurial drive to what I have seen and learned living on the continent. So here are a few examples that have hit headlines, which you may or may not have heard of. The first one is MFS Africa. On June 6th, this company, which is the continent's largest facilitator of digital payments, who integrates more than 320 million mobile money accounts across Africa, purchased an Oklahoma-based global technology partners in a deal that was worth $34 million US. So this is one of the first times, a very rare instance, in which an African fintech actually made an acquisition of a US-based fintech. And this was, Global Technology Partners is the biggest processor of prepaid cards in Africa. So this was to facilitate and add value to MFS Africa's client base and market base. Another thing is this report here was done in 2021 by Brighter. It was a collaboration between Brighter Bridges, which is a market intelligence firm, and Catalyst Fund, which invests across Africa. And the name of the report is The State of Fintech in Emerging Markets. So if you look here at the trend of growth, this is total fintech funding by region over 5 years. And if you look at it, the green on the left represents Africa, Latin America is the middle gray, and then India is the on the right with the orange/yellow. You can see that Africa, while the quantum, the number in terms of total fintech funding has started small, it's been a consistent growth trajectory. In fact, revenues and investment into this space has almost grown exponentially. So in 2021, fintechs in Africa, so after this 2020, raised $3 billion US. That's 62% of the entire amount of funding that was raised in 2021 in Africa. And that was more than double 2020s and more than triple 2019s. We even talked about the slowdown in investment right now, currently in the global markets. But this year, African fintechs have raised the same amount of funding in the first 5 months of 2022 as they did in the whole of 2021. So African fintechs are bucking the trend of reduction in investment in fintech. Another interesting headline, or another interesting sort of instance that I want to mention, is this report by McKinsey & Company, which was released on August 30th, just 3 weeks before our FinTech Summit. And we actually had the pleasure of having one of the partners visit the summit and speak. This was released basically to illustrate that fintech in Africa is entering a new phase and is going into a new level of growth. They project in this report that fintech revenue in Africa has the potential to grow 8 times in the next 3 years. So 8 times would equate to $30 billion US. by 2025. And this is based on the fact that only 10% of transactions in Africa are done globally. So, these are stories which illustrate why I am so bullish around growth in Africa. Now, the obvious question is, why is fintech booming in Africa? And this is my take on it, is that it's actually a variety of elements. Some of it macroeconomic, some of it, perhaps a little more microeconomic, and just very different elements that I really believe are causative for what's happening in fintech right now. So the one I'd like to start with is innovation by necessity. I live in Canada, where a new iPhone comes out. I'm not an Apple user, so maybe I shouldn't speak to that. But new Samsungs, iPhones come out every few months, and we actually have a hard time keeping up with them, and end up often, the wisdom is to buy not the latest model, but the one before, because they've already sorted the glitches out. But in Africa, as we've already discussed, because of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of access to necessary goods and services, innovation happens by necessity. So you have entrepreneurs who are solving very, very local issues that affect not just themselves, but their communities. And because of that, as we'll see, there are very strong impact dimensions to a lot of these solutions. When I say impact, I'm referring to ESG, environmental, social governance elements. And as I've mentioned, 65% of the continent is underbanked or unbanked. The informal economy contributes more than 50% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. And these informal workers require access to financial services in order to be efficient, in order to be able to purchase their next set of inventory, and to be able to grow their businesses. There's also a growing middle class. The other thing is that it's a very youthful market. And what does that mean? As I've mentioned, the average age is 19. So, as you and I would probably know, in our respective countries and environments, youth are often the ones who understand, who know how to use the latest technology. It's no different in Africa. The youth are very tech savvy. And they also have a very disruptive mindset because, independence across Africa from colonial powers happened in my parents' lifetime, so 50s, 60s, and onwards. So you had a lot of liberation movements that happened during that time, in which, loyalty to the movement and to parties, which ushered in independence, was really, really important. But for the following generations, there's not really a strong sense of alliance or allegiance to a lot of these liberating sort of parties. And I say that with a caveat because that's different depending on where you are in Africa. But you do have youth that are willing to disrupt, to find and create solutions that work for them. It's also a mobile first region. So mobile penetration in Africa is sitting at around, in sub-Saharan Africa, around 46%, which is higher than India and has been growing astronomically. In fact, mobile penetration is more than 100% in some markets. So that means people have more than one phone. And in Nigeria and Ghana have actually seen the highest growth in smartphone usage in the world. Now, remember that mobile does not necessarily mean smartphone. In Africa, you still have about 50% of people that are using what we call feature phones. So those are the phones that didn't have internet connectivity. However, these phones are catered to in a lot of fintech solutions. And along with this has also been just the fact that there's lower data costs. There's been a lot of last mile connectivity, which has been happening. Facebook and Google have sponsored and led the placement of subsea cables around Africa. And over the last year, so many subsea cables were brought inland and last mile connectivity. So it's driving the cost of data down. The other thing is lack of legacy infrastructure. And this is interesting because it creates what we call a leapfrog effect, meaning that because 65% of the continent is already unbanked or underbanked, there are people who have never had a bank account or even really set foot in a bank. However, these people will have access to some digital services, digital financial services, so to fintech. So you're having this situation where it's not people have been used to traditional brick and mortar banks and are looking for more effective, less costly ways to bank. These are people who for the first time are banking and they're using fintech. So that's the leapfrog effect, which we're seeing. You know, for the first time, they're getting insurance through a fintech because the banks will not underwrite them, and so on. And then the last thing I'd like to mention is rapid urbanization. And urban ecosystems really are places where technology thrives. And this is part of what's driving the advancement and the adoption in fintech. So, you know, this talk was supposed to address growth, avenues for growth. And I've already explained some of the sort of avenues for growth, but I'd like to actually highlight a few specific examples in terms of products where growth is really occurring. So one of them is remittances. And I should also say, as a private equity investor, we always wear a lens where we want to come in and see how to accomplish and achieve growth, not just at revenue level, but also in terms of profitability. So we're really focused on value. And there are various methodologies that one can use across Africa to grow most companies, especially tech companies, which are asset light and can scale. However, you know, at the same time, it can be very nuanced. So in terms of remittances, one of the great examples I like to think of is World Remit, which many of you might be familiar with. It's a globally recognized and market leader when it comes to remittances. It was founded by a man, Ismail Ahmed, from Somaliland. Now, Somaliland is not even recognized as a country by most states. And he started this solution in Somaliland. So he was solving for a very local problem, which is he wanted to be able to send money back home, you know, and do it freely, do it cheaply and quickly. And, you know, it was actually, that was what prompted this whole thing. It turns out that remittances are counter-cyclical. So the World Bank had predicted that in 2020, you know, global remittances, and specifically into sub-Saharan Africa, would decrease by 20%. However, they grew by 2.3% if you exclude Nigeria. The following year, still under the pandemic, they grew by 14%. So remittances provide a wonderful avenue for growth. Also, sending money to Africa is still really expensive. It's typically about 8%. The global average is 3%, and that's our target. Cryptocurrencies, you can get it for cheaper. But remittances are the highest earner of Forex in Africa at the moment. So this is a wonderful space to get into if you can solve for reducing these fees, especially. Mobile money is another one. I think a lot of people have heard of M-Pesa, which was really pioneered in Silicon Savannah, which is Kenya. Currently, today, that industry is worth $1 trillion US. And 50% of the accounts globally in mobile money are based in Africa. And of those 50%, they are transacting 70% of the global value. So $700 million is transacted in Africa out of the $1 trillion global industry. So this is, again, a massive opportunity because, again, they're still, you know, massively underbanked. Only 10% of transactions are done digitally. So this is a really growing opportunity. And neobanking. We actually had Chidi Okpala from Asante Financial Services Group on the summit, on the Fintech summit. And basically the issue is that there's a massive credit gap of around $330 billion US annually for micro and small enterprises across Africa. They cannot access credit because traditional institutions, even multilateral financial institutions and so on, are not able to address, they just don't have the frameworks for incorporating, especially micro enterprises, which comprise 97% of these, the continent's MSMEs. And these neobanks and digital banking platforms are actually able to return about 80% savings to their customers. So this is also a fantastic space to get into. Let me just do a time check here. How are we doing? Because I can't see my timer.
You're doing good. Keep on going.
Okay, fantastic. So, you know, another thing I would highlight is that McKinsey has highlighted themselves or codified 6 different characteristics that they see as defining winning fintechs in terms of where growth is available. So one is that these fintechs will match value propositions to the market. The second thing is that they would acquire a large base of active users quickly. They would have clear monetization strategies and roll out effectively. They would manage lower expected revenue per customer. They would understand and solve for Africa's offline market, and actively engage, align, and work with regulators. Now, much could be said about each of these because these are really core and have been done, are being done by a lot of these solutions that I've already mentioned. Let's talk about avenues for impact. So, you know, because Africa in the financial services, excuse me, presents pretty much a blue ocean, you will find that most solutions can provide some level of impact, but we want to go beyond that. We want to be intentional. We want to have frameworks, we want to have metrics and KPIs so that impact is not purely happenstance, but it is planned, it is intentional. These are a few really key areas where fintech provides impact to Africans. So there's financial literacy, you know, and this is basic training in terms of financial management, you know, and so on. Financial inclusion. The folks that tend to be the most excluded are youth, women, those who live in rural areas, as well as those who are from low-income backgrounds. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Managed services for small businesses who may not have the sophisticated systems to manage payroll, inventory, etc. These are things that fintechs are offering a lot of their clients or customers. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, I just mentioned some of the excluded segments of society, but as well, if you look at fintech founders, only 3% of them are women that successfully attract funding. When it comes to, you know, believe it or not, Black African fintech founders who attract funding, if you look at funding for the last 10 years, from 2012 to 2022, essentially, only 30% of the funding that goes into fintech goes into companies where there's at least one Black founder. And there's some real issues there, especially, you know, this is a separate conversation, but when you look at how investment is performing across a continent, you will see that this misalignment in terms of representation has very real impacts. Fintechs are solving for a just energy transition. You know, fintechs are empowering, for instance, renewable energy companies. And themselves, fintechs use a lot of data, use, you know, data centers and so on, which, you know, they're bringing green practices into that whole supply chain. And then there's also employee benefits, which is huge, because, you know, healthcare, for instance, will solve a lot of the wicked issues that persist across a continent. And these can be available to fintech companies and their employees. So these are just some of the frameworks that I'm familiar with and have used, the 2X Challenge, Future Fit Businesses, and of course, the SDGs. Risks and challenges. So, you know, if we're being fair, there are real risks and challenges. And these are three that I'd like to highlight. One is an uncertain regulatory environment. As typically happens across the world, policy lags innovation. And in the case of M-Pesa, it took 7 years after it was founded for Kenya to actually issue any kind of regulation around mobile money. So, you know, this kind of uncertainty can be very tricky for fintechs. There's currently about 9 regulatory sandboxes across Africa, which provide a safe space for fintechs to innovate and try things. But, you know, at the same time, that's not the same everywhere. And as well, when you look at policy harmonization across countries, there can be real challenges there. Some fintechs have done exceedingly well in their home countries and, you know, started operating in other countries only to be slapped later with some kind of fee or actually being refused, you know, the right to operate in their new countries because of this. Also, weak local funding system. So we find that about 80% of the capital investment that flows into Africa originates from outside of Africa, mainly from the US. And again, when investors are trying to find the right entrepreneurs to back, human bias, you tend to invest in people that speak, talk, sound like you. And that's a problem for the local ecosystem. But the other thing is challenging the local funding ecosystem to step up, such as the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and so on, to be anchor investors in a lot of these fintechs. So they can also, really have a part in it. And then the other thing I'd highlight is the underdevelopment of key infrastructure. So I've mentioned, the lack of infrastructure across the continent, connectivity, power. These are key issues. So these are issues that need to be solved so that fintech will not try and grow in a vacuum, so to speak. Fintech is obviously reliant on a lot of these infrastructure pieces. So these things are also key to be addressed. And with that brings me to the end of my presentation. I did talk very quickly through it, so I welcome an opportunity now to discuss with you in more detail, if we have any time.
We have time.
Yeah.
So first of all, that's great, Tapfuma. Let's maybe just highlight the key speakers right now. So very nice presentation. It's clear that you're talking about Africa can be the next future. It's a big continent, different countries to enter on. And the insights over there was the starting points are different in Africa than in other countries. Mobile, you start with mobile. You start with the fact that that's there. You start with the fact that there is a market which is somewhat unpenetrated. So there's a huge untapped market also to go after. And you got countries like Kenya and Ghana and maybe Nigeria and South Africa who are doing really well. So a lot of good things over here, and where there's ambiguity and uncertainty, for those who actually go first are the ones who are going to reap the benefits if it happens, right? If it happens, and we know China is there. China is investing heavily in Africa. We now know India is also investing heavily in Africa for infrastructure and everything else. There's a second colonialism of a different type happening, right? Of what was going on from Asia versus Europe now into Africa. So people have always believed in the potential of Africa, what is going to be next, and the people which are out there. Where are you believing we'll be getting the news of that acquisition in Oklahoma, the news of those things? Which country are we going to start hearing of high speed of acquisitions or partnering and alliances with American, European, and Chinese and Indian companies? Which country do you think is a starting point for that?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple ways it could go, but one country I'd have to highlight is Nigeria. Nigeria is making waves, not just in fintech, right across the world. And I think there's a couple of factors. One is that Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, 200 million people. So even if 10% of them or less, excuse me, are successful entrepreneurs, you just imagine the impact. And because you have a lot of oil wealth, actually, in fact, that came out of the oil industry, you have these families that have been able to afford to send a lot of their children abroad for, education at some of the top institutions. And not just that, you have, Nigerians have always been brilliant, going back to the days of Benin City, where they had the biggest city in ancient times that Europeans came and had never seen anything like it. So when you bring that kind of innovation to the world, you start to access global resources, which can be channeled back, through the diaspora, whether it's the education piece and the knowledge sharing, and whether it's talent, whether it's investment money, capital flowing, into. So I think Nigeria is very well positioned for that.
Excellent. So 1 out of 4 African is Nigerian. So just if anybody doesn't know that, it's a huge number. And so more than likely, and then even for me, when I was getting my PhD and I was working lithium-ion batteries, the guys who won the Nobel Prize, one of their #1 star graduate students was a Nigerian who worked with me, Anaba Anani, on the lithium-ion batteries that we produced at Motorola. And so we got Nigerians who are scientists, Nigerians who are politicians, Nigerians who are writers, but also Africans in general who are there in the large numbers. So it's a diaspora that you're talking about, which is now in Europe, in Africa, in the US and other places. How are they organizing, whether to raise funding, whether to raise startup culture, whether to start innovation at the government level or at the corporate level or at the SME level? What are you guys doing? Where are other people doing? so we can tap into the critical masses? Where are the critical masses?
It's funny. When I first started my consultancy here in Canada about 5 years ago to facilitate trade investment, I was one of a handful. Now there's almost every other diasporan is running an organization that facilitates trade and investment with the African markets. So, I think on an individual level, it's happening. I have seen the growth of angel networks, which is very interesting. So, diasporans who are specifically supporting seed, pre-seed level startups right across Africa. So I've seen that happening. You have some fintechs, such as one called Daba, which is based out of the US, and they have created this platform where you can invest anywhere, from anywhere, into any asset class across Africa. So, they're creating the convenience, the ability to invest with small amounts and not being an accredited investor yourself per se. On a corporate level, how are they organizing? I don't know exactly how that's happening. I mean, I suppose this is where we talk about the MFS Africas, that are penetrating, and then you talk about some of the investors who are starting to look towards Africa and have been engaged in Africa, especially coming out of the US. On a governmental level, I would say there's a lot of intra-Africa energy at the moment, because intra-Africa trade is only about 13 to 15%, compared to Europe, where I think it's 60%. And so, you had the advent of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is now the biggest free trade area in the world, which is meant to facilitate intra-Africa trade and boost that. So, just aligned to that, you have an initiative called the Pan-African Payment Settlement System. And this is specifically so that when Africans are transacting cross-border, they do not have to route it via Europe and wait 3 days for the, So I would say that there's a lot of intra-Africa energy at the moment. But of course, we have trade missions happening all the time. And we have African delegations coming out here, Canadian delegations going there, not so much yet, but that's what I'm observing.
Tapfuma, just a question. In countries like Dubai or Colombia, there is a top-down initiatives of innovation-based economies. They're basically saying our country cannot no longer depend on resources, oil or copper or whatever. We have to create a society of knowledge, a knowledge-based society, and from that knowledge-based society, create what's next and what else. And we are seeing strong efforts. Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed. In Colombia, they've been driving thousands of small businesses into thinking about what's next, what else. Brazil's been investing in innovation, saying can we not be left behind. Shanghai has put innovation districts in every city in China. There's an innovation district, which is all about what's next, what else. In Africa, where do you see whether there's a fintech cluster where the government's kind of saying, we're going to give you the internet support, we're going to give you infrastructure support, but we will be the center of excellence, the cluster for different things. Fintech is your topic, but it might be fintech and maybe it might be education. It might be something else. Are you hearing this? Are you seeing something? What are you observing?
That's a great question, Atendra. And actually at the FinTech Summit, we invited Professor Bitanga Ndemo, and he was the architect of Silicon Savannah. So that was where M-Pesa came out of. It's basically the Kenyan ecosystem, very successful. And he was actually hired into that position himself, saying that he had no idea really what he was getting into. But in Kenya, you had a very intentional plan to build out an ecosystem. And I believe that we need to template that. There's also Silicon Cape, which is in Cape Town, another cluster. You've got a cluster in Nigeria and in Egypt. So those are the four, it's kind of called the diamond, real tech innovation clusters. And there has been strong top-down leadership in these spaces. I believe we need to template these and actually replicate these across the continent. Rwanda is another country which is really focused on innovation and has really established some core sort of entities or organizations to drive this. But they haven't yet achieved that status, I would say.
No, I like that, where you are highlighting that there are Silicon Savannah, Silicon Cape. So they're beginning to focus into this kind of areas. So for everybody listening in on this think tank, I mean, these are maybe entry points of which countries have got this clusters which will be more receptive to external partners and everything else. How about universities? You went to the Rotman School because there was reasons that Rotman School gave you, channels, networks, and other things. Are there universities in Africa which are going to emerge as the next equivalent? And maybe you can never be an MIT, but aspiring to be the MITs and the Harvards and the Stanfords, as we see in the US. Are there places where you're seeing universities aspiring for that, where there is the mindset of the next 1,000 years?
You know, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I'm totally qualified to answer that, but I do know that the universities have been core to these innovation systems, you know, and I think, you know, what's often highlighted as the hubs that are driving innovation are typically incubators and accelerators, which are not attached to universities. So you got, like, you know, from the international Y Combinators and Techstars, which have I think Y Combinator leads as an international accelerator that invests in Africa. And then you've got, you know, local ones like MEST in Ghana, and so on. So, you know, you have a whole lot of these hubs. I think universities are still catching up to being the drivers of innovation. That's my read on it in the moment. However, I know that there are universities which are, you know, very much engaged. So yeah, but I'd have to do a little more research to speak to that.
No worries. So the reason I'm bringing that up is we have our colleague from Korea. Korea was an extremely poor country in 1953. But by now it's one of the richest countries on the planet. And they focused on the universities, whether it was Seoul National or Yonsei University, and they really went technical. They sent thousands of people to the US to get trained in physics, chemistry. They brought them back. And there was a reason why they came back, that managed the diaspora a little bit better. And so they're leaving and not ever coming back. And then they were, that recipe seems to be one of the best winning recipes of a success case of how that happened. And Botswana, as one country, was an example that was brought up to me of the fastest growing GDP in the world almost, right? And they were able to send the people out, and the people came back to Botswana because it was safe, it was secure, and there was growth for them.
Yeah.
So diaspora, let's talk about the diaspora. How do you get the diaspora to really get excited and bypass the opportunity that the United States or Canada or Europe provides, because it's easier way. You don't have to work very hard to do okay.
Yeah.
You got to work really hard to do okay in Africa.
Yeah.
Right. But if you do things right in Africa, you can be super rich very quickly.
Yeah.
Right. While in the United States, you got to work very hard to get super rich.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the opportunity. Big fish, small pond, big fish. Right. So how do you get a diaspora to really see the opportunity?
You know, I think it's interesting. So almost all Africans who come as first generation Africans to the diaspora are sending money back home. You know, that's why remittances are just such a powerful engine. So there is an immediate connectivity to what's happening on the continent. In terms of getting them to go back, I think it's creating an enabling environment. You know, you have scenarios, for instance, where doctors have wanted to work in some countries like Zimbabwe, where my family is from, but, you know, it has not been a conducive environment. You know, so you have to have an enabling environment. You have even some tech companies which have, you know, had to leave for greener shores because the ecosystem wasn't supportive enough. So we have to be very intentional about that, creating a supportive environment. But the other thing I would say is there have been some incredible PR moves. Like Ghana had the Year of Return a couple of years ago, and you had A-list celebrities going to Ghana saying, you know, this was where a large majority of enslaved peoples left from this port. We're going back to that port as diasporans, and we're reclaiming our birthright. And that has been a powerful, powerful movement. You know, you've seen people actually pick up Ghanaian passports. Idris Elba went to Sierra Leone, got a Sierra Leonean passport because that's where he's from. So, you know, there is a way in which if we get our messaging right, we create a pride, we create something to be celebrated, something that moves you, you know, emotionally as well, to say, yes, you know, this is where I'm from. And I have a stake in what happens there. And what happens there affects what happens where I am as well.
Tapfuma, and just for the rest of the audience, we are neighbors. I was born in Zambia. Tapfuma was born in Zimbabwe. Northern Rhodesia is what they used to call when I was out there, and Rhodesia is what Zimbabwe was. And both these countries were super rich countries in resources and everything else. And political systems and everything else kind of created a logic that the best education was not in our home countries. And you go to other countries and then you basically make a home out of it. It's very hard to return and to do more things, but the hearts of people are still there.
Yeah.
Right? And so, so there's something to be said. So let me try and summarize. I'm going to give you 1 minute to wrap up this conversation. This is what I've heard for everybody on the audience over here, GIMI think tank members. Africa is still there as the great big opportunity. The penetration rates of everything is not large. It's the 10 to 20 to 30% penetration rates. Technology is the enabler to be able to spread everything across, and they're already mobile ready. Therefore, you can spread quickly, whether it's fintech, whether it's edutech, whether it's insurtech, whatever. Technology can be spread through the phones much faster than ever for the last 100 years. So the opportunity is there. In that opportunity, there is a equivalence of the challenge of social justice, and there's opportunities from the US and Europe to leverage the social justice equations to say, wait a second, what can we do to fix equality around these things to make things happen? And there's emotional agreement that social justice is needed, right? So that needs to be leveraged, of course. And then there's a very smart diaspora. It's a very smart diaspora of thousands and thousands of people across Europe, the United States, Canada, who can be tapped into, whether it's in hedge funds, private equity funds, and other things, because they are connected to the government leaders, they're connected politically, they're connected to the corporates of Africa. And if you talk to the right people, you should be able to find the funding for the opportunity, and then you can unleash what is the biggest potential opportunity on the planet right now. And not through colonialism and not through harvesting in a negative way, but in a win-win opportunity that lifts up the people all the way up. Tapfuma, I give you the floor, but thank you for coming here. You got the last minute.
I don't think there's anything left to say after what you've said. You've encapsulated so well. What I would say is, please, if you are serious about engaging with the continent and you would like a starting place, please do reach out. Through AfriFursa, we're all about connecting ecosystems. And, I love South-South partnerships because I think there's a lot that's in common between Latin America, the Caribbean, African markets as well, Asia, India. And I think that's why we tend to partner so well together. Thank you so much for the platform. And let me just say that, this is an incredible thing that you've done here, Prof. And an incredible space, incredible opportunity to engage. That's
great, Tapfuma. You're always welcome back. Tapfuma has been helping us during COVID also to find other GIMI think tank members in Africa. Yeah. And so thanks for all the support as always. And I'm going to wrap this session up for everybody. Just GIMI think tank meets every week. We talk about what's going on innovation in other parts of the world. This was today about Africa and innovation and fintech. We talk about innovation management and how to do innovation management better, faster. And we also talk about the trends, the big trends. So this talk was a combination of trends. Africa is a trend. It was about what's going on in Africa, but also different ways to manage innovation. And I think the digital platforms, the diaspora, and the social networks are the way to make things happen in Africa. So with that, remind everybody in the GIMI think tank, we can do a lot. We have a mission to get 1 million people trained on innovation worldwide. And the way we're going to do it is together, we can. And Ron will say, and we shall, and we will. Thank you, everybody.